I learned something important the moment the alien queen raised her blade above my head. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can say in the universe is a simple compliment. The throne hall of the Seralith Dominion stretched nearly 100 feet across, carved from shimmering black crystal that reflected the cold violet light of their star through towering windows. Rows of armored alien warriors stood motionless along the walls, each nearly 7 feet tall, their silver armor glowing faintly as if it breathed with them. In the center of that enormous chamber, kneeling on polished stone that felt like ice through my flight suit, was me, Lucas Hayes, human survey pilot, accidental trespasser, and apparently the first human ever brought before the queen of this world. My shuttle had crashed barely 2 miles from what I later learned was their most sacred valley. I had been trying to map mineral deposits, not rewrite alien law, but intentions didn't matter much when your ship landed somewhere forbidden. Their patrols found me within minutes. No shouting, no chaos, just silent figures stepping from the mist like statues that had suddenly decided to walk. They took my scanner, escorted me through a city of towering blue spires, and brought me here. Now I was kneeling beneath a ceiling that rose nearly 80 feet above me, staring at a throne carved from a single block of translucent crystal. And standing in front of that throne was the reason every soldier in the room looked nervous. Queen Seralith was taller than anyone else in the chamber, easily 7.5 feet, her presence filling the room the way gravity fills space. Her skin shimmered with a deep ocean blue that caught the light like polished glass, and her long silver hair moved gently even though the air was still, as if it followed some current no human could feel. Gold eyes studied me with the quiet intensity of someone used to being obeyed instantly. When she stepped forward, the sound of her boots echoed through the vast hall like a slow drumbeat. I could feel the warmth of the energy blade in her hand from nearly 6 feet away, a soft hum vibrating through the floor beneath my knees. Human, her voice said, calm and impossibly clear, carried through a translator somewhere in the room. Your kind crossed into sacred territory. I opened my mouth, but honestly I didn't have a good explanation for accidentally violating an alien holy site. She lifted the blade slightly, not threatening, just decisive, like someone about to close a book after finishing the last page. Around us, dozens of warriors watched in perfect silence. No one moved. No one whispered. The whole chamber felt like it was holding its breath. I remember thinking that if this was how things ended, it was a pretty impressive place to go out. The crystal walls reflected her silhouette behind her like a crown of shadows, and the violet star outside the windows painted everything in soft alien light. Then she stopped directly in front of me and looked down, her golden eyes locking onto mine with a level of focus that made the rest of the room disappear. And that was the moment my brain decided to betray every survival instinct I had. My brain chose that exact moment to ignore every survival instinct I had. Maybe it was the pressure of 100 silent eyes watching me. Maybe it was the strange calm in Queen Seralith's gaze, the kind that belongs to someone who has never had a reason to doubt her own authority. Or maybe it was simply the fact that the universe occasionally rewards honesty even when honesty is a terrible strategy. Whatever the reason, I looked straight at the towering alien queen, took a slow breath, and spoke the first thought that crossed my mind. You are beautiful. The words left my mouth before my brain could catch them, hanging in the cool air of the crystal hall like something fragile and irreversible. For a fraction of a second nothing happened. Then the universe stopped moving. The low hum of the energy blade softened, as if even the weapon itself had forgotten what it was supposed to do. The queen's golden eyes widened just enough for me to notice, and the entire chamber seemed to freeze in place. I could feel the reaction ripple outward through the room, even though no one made a sound. The warriors lining the walls stiffened in a way that was almost mechanical, like statues suddenly aware of gravity. One of the officers standing near the throne shifted his stance slightly, the movement so small that most humans would have missed it, but in that silence it sounded as loud as a door closing. Queen Seralith did not lower the blade immediately. Instead, she studied me with a new expression, one I had not seen before in her face. It was not anger. It was not confusion either. It looked more like someone encountering a language they thought they understood, only to discover an entirely new meaning hidden inside it. The seconds stretched. I could hear my own breathing inside the helmet collar of my suit and feel the faint chill of the polished floor pressing through my knee pads. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Finally the blade dipped slightly, no longer aimed at me, but resting loosely at her side. A quiet murmur moved through the chamber, quickly silenced by the simple act of the queen raising one hand. When she spoke again, her voice carried a subtle change, as if the words themselves had become heavier. "Human Lucas Hayes," she said slowly, pronouncing my name with careful precision. "Do you understand what you have just said?" I blinked, suddenly aware that I had probably stepped into some cultural minefield that my crash course in alien diplomacy had not covered. "I meant it as a compliment," I answered honestly. A faint ripple of tension moved through the soldiers again, but the queen's gaze never left mine. Her head tilted slightly, silver hair catching the violet starlight pouring through the massive windows behind her throne. For the first time since I entered the chamber, something like curiosity appeared in her eyes. "Among my people," she said quietly. "Those words are not spoken lightly." She took one slow step closer. The distance between us shrank to barely 3 feet. I could see faint patterns in her blue skin now, delicate lines that shimmered like reflections on deep water. The energy blade dimmed further in her hand until its glow was little more than a pale ribbon of light. "Those words," the queen continued, her voice softer but far more intense, "are reserved for one purpose." She paused, studying my face as if searching for a hidden motive. Around us the entire court remained perfectly still, waiting. "They are a declaration." The room seemed to lean inward with her next sentence. "In our culture, human," she said, "to say what you just said is to claim the right to stand beside the queen." For a moment I was certain I had misunderstood her, because the idea sounded impossible even inside my own head. Claim the right to stand beside the queen. That was not exactly the kind of phrase a stranded survey pilot expected to hear while kneeling on the floor of an alien throne hall. I stared up at Queen Seralith, trying to decide whether I had just accidentally insulted an entire civilization or proposed something far stranger. The violet light from the distant star poured through the towering windows behind her, outlining her tall silhouette in a soft glow that made the crystal walls sparkle like frozen lightning. Every soldier in the chamber was still watching, their armored forms perfectly still, but the tension in the air felt different now, less like a storm waiting to break, and more like a puzzle no one had expected. I cleared my throat carefully. "Your Majesty," I said slowly, choosing every word like it might trigger an alarm. On Earth that sentence usually just means someone appreciates how you look. A faint ripple passed through the room again. It was subtle, but this time I noticed the difference. Some of the warriors were not shocked anymore. They were curious. Queen Seralith tilted her head slightly, the movement graceful and deliberate. Her golden eyes studied my face the way a scientist studies an unfamiliar star, not with anger, but with careful attention. "So your species speaks powerful declarations without understanding their weight," she said quietly. I could not help smiling a little at that. "Honestly, Your Majesty, humans do that all the time." For the first time since I had entered the chamber, something unexpected appeared on her face. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. The faintest hint of amusement touched the corner of her mouth before disappearing again behind the calm authority of a ruler. She turned slightly, glancing across the enormous hall where her officers stood waiting. The crystal throne behind her reflected the movement in a dozen shimmering angles. "You entered sacred territory," she said, returning her attention to me. "You arrived in a machine that pierced our sky without permission. And yet instead of fear, you speak to me as if you stand among equals." I shrugged carefully from my kneeling position. "Back home my boss says the same thing about me." A few of the soldiers shifted again, and this time I was almost certain I heard a quiet breath of laughter somewhere along the far wall before it vanished into silence. Queen Seralith stepped another foot closer, closing the remaining distance between us. I could now see the delicate patterns moving faintly across her blue skin, like reflections of sunlight through deep ocean water. The energy blade in her hand dimmed until its glow faded completely, and then the weapon powered down with a soft click. The sound echoed gently through the vast hall. "Human Lucas Hayes," she said again, her voice calmer now, but far more focused. "If your words were spoken in ignorance, then your life may not require the punishment our law demands. That sounded promising. However, she continued, lifting one elegant hand toward the enormous windows where the alien star burned beyond the crystal towers of the city. The meaning of those words cannot simply be erased. She looked back down at me, and the curiosity in her golden eyes had grown stronger. Because now my court wishes to know something. The room leaned inward again as she spoke her next question slowly and clearly. Human, she said, if you did not know the meaning of what you declared, why did you say it with such confidence? I considered the Queen's question carefully because the entire hall was listening for my answer, and the wrong explanation could easily undo whatever fragile curiosity had replaced the earlier tension in the room. The polished crystal floor beneath my knees reflected the violet light of the distant star, and for a moment I focused on that glow while I searched for the simplest truth I could offer. Finally, I looked back up at Queen Saralith and gave the only answer that felt honest. Because it was true. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not the tense quiet of soldiers waiting for a command. It was the quiet of a room trying to understand something unfamiliar. The Queen studied me again with those steady golden eyes, and I could see the faint shifting patterns in her blue skin reflecting the starlight, like moving water. Explain, she said calmly. I nodded slightly. Where I come from, I said. Humans tend to say what they notice first. Sometimes it gets us into trouble, but it also means we do not hide simple truths. I gestured carefully toward the towering windows behind her throne. When I first saw this world from orbit, it looked incredible. The oceans were bright turquoise, the continents looked like carved stone, and the sky had that purple glow. Then your patrol found me and brought me here. And when you walked into the room, honestly, you looked like you belonged to that sky more than anyone else here. A faint murmur moved across the chamber again, softer this time. Queen Saralith remained perfectly still, but her gaze sharpened as if she was measuring every word. So you believe beauty justifies bold speech, she said. I shook my head. No, Your Majesty. I believe honesty does. That answer seemed to interest her even more. She took a slow step away from me and turned slightly, looking across the immense chamber as if considering the reaction of her court. The towering crystal pillars caught the violet starlight and scattered it across the room in long glowing streaks. Dozens of armored figures stood in silent rows, their attention fixed on the conversation unfolding at the center of the hall. Finally, the Queen turned back toward me. Your species is unusual, she said thoughtfully. Most beings who stand before a throne speak carefully crafted words meant to protect themselves. I smiled faintly. Humans do that too sometimes. We just do it badly. This time the quiet sound of restrained amusement moved through the soldiers again, impossible to hide completely. The Queen noticed it as well. Her expression remained composed, but the curiosity in her eyes had clearly deepened. She walked slowly toward the great crystal throne and rested one hand lightly against its arm, her tall form framed by the soft light pouring through the windows behind her. Among my people, she said, truth is respected, but declarations carry consequences. She looked back down at me. The statement you made in this chamber has already changed how this court sees you. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds either very good or very dangerous. Possibly both, she replied. For a moment, she simply watched me in silence again, studying my face as if searching for something hidden behind my words. Then she asked a question that made the entire hall lean inward once more. Human Lucas Hayes, Queen Saralith said slowly. If you knew those words could bind you to responsibilities far greater than survival, would you still have spoken them so freely? The Queen's question hung in the air like a weight that the entire throne hall could feel. If you knew those words could bind you to responsibilities far greater than survival, would you still have spoken them so freely? I thought about that for a moment while the violet light from the distant star continued to spill across the crystal floor, reflecting off the polished armor of the silent warriors surrounding us. The truth was that a few minutes earlier I had been worried only about staying alive long enough to see another sunrise, or whatever passed for sunrise on a world with a purple sky. Now the conversation had somehow turned into a philosophical debate about honesty, destiny, and alien cultural law. Humans were not usually trained for that kind of situation. I slowly stood up from my kneeling position, careful not to move too quickly. No one in the chamber stopped me, which I took as a good sign. When I straightened to my full height, I was still a good foot and a half shorter than Queen Seraph, but at least I no longer felt like a statue placed at her feet. I met her gaze again and answered honestly. Yes. The word echoed softly in the vast chamber. A few of the soldiers shifted again, clearly surprised that I did not hesitate longer. The Queen watched me closely. Explain, she said once more, her voice calm but clearly interested in what I would say next. I spread my hands slightly. Back on Earth, humans make decisions without knowing the full consequences all the time. We explore oceans without knowing what lives beneath the surface. We build machines that fly into space even though we know they might not come back. If we waited until we understood every possible outcome, we would never move forward. I gestured toward the enormous crystal windows overlooking the alien city beyond the palace. Your world is incredible. Your people built a civilization that can shape crystal towers 200 feet tall and light an entire city with the glow of one distant star. If speaking honestly to the person who leads all of that carries some responsibility, I guess I would still accept that. The Queen listened without interrupting. Her golden eyes seemed to glow brighter in the reflected starlight as she studied my face, searching again for something deeper behind the words. You speak as though responsibility does not frighten you, she said quietly. I shrugged. Responsibility always frightens people. Humans just pretend it does not. For the third time since this conversation began, the faint sound of restrained laughter passed through the chamber. It was not disrespectful. It sounded more like relief. Queen Seraph turned slightly, glancing across the rows of armored figures who had been witnessing this strange exchange between a human pilot and the ruler of their world. Then she looked back at me again, and something about her expression had changed. The anger that filled the room when I first arrived was completely gone now. In its place was something far more complicated. Curiosity was still there, but now it was joined by something else. Consideration. She walked slowly down the short set of steps leading away from the throne and stopped directly in front of me again. The distance between us was barely 2 feet now. I could see the faint reflections of the crystal ceiling in her golden eyes. Human Lucas Hayes, she said softly. Do you realize that by your own reasoning, you may have just volunteered for a role in my court that no human has ever held before? For a moment, I simply stared at Queen Seraph, trying to decide if I had heard her correctly. A role in her court. The words sounded surreal even inside my own thoughts. Just a short time ago, I had been a survey pilot flying a mineral scan across an unfamiliar world, measuring rock density and atmospheric pressure like any other Tuesday. Now I was standing in the center of an alien throne hall nearly 100 feet wide, surrounded by warriors in silver armor, having a calm conversation with a ruler who had the authority to command an entire civilization. Humans were not trained for that kind of career change. I let out a slow breath and glanced around the chamber for the first time since I stood up. The massive crystal pillars reached nearly 80 feet toward the ceiling, their surfaces catching the violet glow of the distant star and scattering it across the floor in long shimmering reflections. Beyond the towering windows, I could see the alien city stretching outward in graceful curves of glowing blue architecture, buildings that rose 200 feet into the sky like sculpted waves frozen in place. It was the kind of view people back on Earth would cross entire galaxies just to photograph. Then I looked back at the Queen standing less than 3 feet away from me. I will admit, I said slowly, that was not exactly part of my original flight plan. A faint ripple of amusement moved through the chamber again. Queen Seraph did not smile, but the light in her golden eyes warmed slightly, as if she appreciated the honesty. Plans, she said calmly, are useful only until reality introduces better ones. I nodded thoughtfully. Humans say something similar. We just phrase it with more sarcasm. That earned another quiet reaction from the rows of soldiers along the walls. The atmosphere in the chamber had changed so much that it almost felt like an entirely different room from the one I first entered. The tension had faded, replaced by something that felt almost like anticipation. Queen Seraph took a slow step to the side and gestured toward the enormous window behind her throne. Look, she said. I followed her gaze. From this height, the city below looked like a field of glowing blue towers arranged along wide, flowing avenues. Small craft moved silently through the air between the structures, their lights reflecting off the crystal architecture like drifting stars. The entire scene stretched for miles in every direction, a living city shaped with a level of elegance that no human architect had ever achieved. This world, the Queen said quietly, has remained hidden from the wider galaxy for many generations. We do not welcome strangers lightly. I nodded. I figured that part out when your patrol surrounded my shuttle. She continued as if she had not heard the comment. And yet today a human stood before this throne and spoke words no outsider has ever spoken to a ruler of my people. She turned back toward me, studying my expression carefully. That alone makes you unusual. I shrugged. I have been called worse. The Queen tilted her head slightly, clearly intrigued by that answer. Then she asked a question that made the entire court lean forward again, waiting for the response. Human Lucas Hayes, she said softly, if I allowed you to remain here for a time, not as a prisoner, but as an observer of our world, would you accept the responsibility that comes with speaking truth inside a royal court? The Queen's question lingered in the vast throne hall like a quiet challenge, and for a moment I simply looked past her shoulder toward the glowing city stretching beyond the crystal windows. From up here the towers looked almost unreal, rising 200 feet into the violet sky like frozen waves of blue light. Small aerial craft drifted silently between them, their paths weaving through the air with the effortless precision of a civilization that had been mastering its world for centuries. Back on Earth, explorers used to cross oceans in wooden ships just to discover places like this. Now I was standing inside one. I turned my attention back to Queen Seralith, who was still watching me carefully, her golden eyes reflecting both the starlight and the reaction of every soldier in the room. An observer. I repeated slowly, making sure I understood the offer correctly. Not a prisoner. Not a prisoner, she confirmed. But not entirely free of responsibility either. That part sounded familiar. Humans had a long history of accepting jobs that came with invisible strings attached. I rubbed the back of my neck thoughtfully and glanced once more at the enormous hall around us. Rows of armored warriors stood along the walls, each one tall, silent, and attentive, yet the earlier tension had almost completely vanished. Instead, there was something else in the air now. Curiosity. They were watching the same way people watch the beginning of an unexpected story. I looked back at the Queen. What kind of responsibility are we talking about exactly? She took a slow step toward the window, her tall silhouette outlined against the violet glow outside. Truth, she said simply. You have demonstrated that your species speaks it without excessive calculation. That is rare among those who stand near power. I could not help smiling a little. Trust me, humans calculate plenty. We just do it quickly. The Queen inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point. Then she turned back toward me, her silver hair catching the starlight like strands of liquid metal. My court is accustomed to careful words, she continued. Advisors speak in circles. Officials speak in strategies. Even generals sometimes speak with caution. But today a human entered this chamber and answered every question with direct honesty. She paused, studying my reaction. That has value. I folded my arms loosely, considering the situation. So you want someone who says what they actually think? Yes, she replied. Even when the truth is inconvenient. I raised an eyebrow. You realize humans specialize in inconvenient truths. That earned another quiet wave of restrained amusement from somewhere among the soldiers. Queen Seralith allowed the reaction to settle before speaking again. Then perhaps that is exactly why this moment occurred, she said thoughtfully. Because sometimes an unexpected voice reveals what an entire court has forgotten how to say. She stepped closer again until only a few feet separated us. The light from the distant star reflected in her golden eyes, steady and calm. So I will ask you once more, Lucas Hayes of Earth, the Queen said softly. Will you remain here for a time and show my people how a human speaks when he chooses honesty over fear? The question settled over the chamber with the quiet weight of a door opening into a future I had not planned for. Remain here for a time and show my people how a human speaks when he chooses honesty over fear. I looked again through the enormous crystal window behind the throne where the alien city stretched across the horizon like a field of glowing blue constellations turned upside down onto the ground. Towers 200 feet tall curved toward the violet sky, their surfaces catching the light of the distant star and scattering it through the air like drifting sparks. Craft moved silently between the structures in smooth, effortless lines. It was the kind of place explorers back on Earth would write entire books about if they ever saw it. And now the queen of that world was asking me to stay. I exhaled slowly and ran a hand through my hair, while the entire court watched my reaction. "You realize," I said carefully, "I came here to scan rocks." A few of the soldiers shifted again, and the faintest ripple of quiet amusement moved along the edges of the chamber. Queen Seralith remained perfectly composed, though there was a spark of something brighter in her golden eyes now. "And yet," she replied calmly, "you discovered something far more interesting." I could not argue with that. I looked around the hall again, noticing details that had been impossible to focus on earlier when survival was the only thing on my mind. The floor beneath us was not simple stone but polished crystal, faint patterns flowing through it like frozen waves. The pillars rising toward the ceiling were easily 80 feet tall, each one carved with subtle lines that seemed to glow faintly whenever the violet light touched them. Even the armor worn by the silent warriors along the walls reflected the light in soft blue tones instead of harsh metal. Everything about this place felt deliberate, designed with a patience humans rarely managed. I turned back to the queen. "If I say yes," I asked slowly, "what exactly happens next?" Queen Seralith stepped away from the throne and began walking across the chamber floor with calm, measured steps, the quiet echo of her boots carrying through the vast hall. She stopped beside the towering window and looked out over the city below. "You observe," she said. "You listen. You speak honestly when asked. That is all." I raised an eyebrow. "That sounds suspiciously simple." "It is simple," she replied. "That is why it is rare." I thought about that for a moment. Back home, entire governments struggled to communicate a single honest sentence without turning it into a paragraph of careful wording. Maybe a civilization that valued direct truth was not such a strange idea after all. Finally, I nodded. "All right," I said. "I will stay." The quiet reaction that followed was not shock this time. It was something more like anticipation, as if the entire court had just witnessed the beginning of a new chapter in a story they did not yet understand. Queen Seralith turned slowly from the window and faced the chamber again. The violet starlight framed her tall silhouette as she looked down at me with calm certainty. "Then welcome to my court, Lucas Hayes of Earth," she said softly. And the moment those words left her lips, every person in the throne hall seemed to realize the same thing at once. A human had just accepted a place beside the ruler of a world that had never before allowed an outsider to remain. The quiet realization that followed the Queen's declaration moved through the chamber like a slow ripple across still water. A human had just been welcomed into the court of a civilization that had spent generations hidden from the rest of the galaxy. I could see the understanding spreading across the faces of the assembled officers, even though they remained disciplined and silent. Some looked thoughtful. Others looked cautiously curious. None of them looked angry anymore. Queen Seralith watched the reaction with the calm patience of someone who had expected it all along. The violet light from the distant star continued to pour through the towering windows behind her throne, casting long, glowing reflections across the crystal floor. For the first time since arriving here, the room felt less like a courtroom and more like the beginning of a conversation. I shifted my weight slightly and glanced around the enormous hall again. Standing there as the only human in a room full of towering blue-skinned warriors was still a surreal experience. But the earlier sense of danger had faded into something far more complicated. I realized something unexpected then. They were not studying me as a threat anymore. They were studying me as a question. Queen Seralith turned slightly toward the assembled court and raised one hand in a calm gesture that instantly focused every eye in the chamber. "This moment will be remembered," she said clearly, her voice carrying easily through the vast hall. "Not because a stranger arrived on our world, but because a stranger chose honesty where caution would have been easier." Her gaze moved briefly across the rows of officers before returning to me again. "Let it be understood that Lucas Hayes of Earth stands here by my decision, not by accident." The statement settled over the room like a formal seal placed upon an agreement. I rubbed the back of my neck again, still adjusting to the idea that my accidental crash landing had somehow turned into a diplomatic milestone. "No pressure," I muttered quietly to myself. Apparently alien hearing was excellent. The queen glanced at me with the faintest trace of amusement. Responsibility rarely waits for comfort, she said. I smiled slightly. That sounds like something my flight instructor used to say right before a difficult landing. The reaction from the court this time was not just quiet amusement. It felt almost welcoming, as though the tension that once filled the room had finally dissolved completely. Queen Seralith stepped away from the throne and approached the center of the chamber again until she stood only a few feet from me. The glow of the distant star caught the edges of her silver hair, giving it the appearance of flowing light. Your presence here will raise questions among my people, she said calmly. Some will wonder why a human has been allowed to remain. Others will be curious about what you might teach us. I nodded thoughtfully. And some will probably think this is a terrible idea. Yes, she replied without hesitation. Leadership often requires accepting that possibility. For a moment, we both looked out toward the city again through the enormous crystal window. The towers glowed softly beneath the violet sky, stretching across miles of landscape like a living constellation. Then the queen spoke again, her voice quieter now but filled with clear intention. Human Lucas Hayes, she said. You once told me that your species speaks honestly even when the truth creates unexpected consequences. I nodded slowly. That does tend to happen. Her golden eyes met mine again, steady and thoughtful. Then perhaps your arrival here was not an accident at all. She paused for a moment before adding the thought that made the entire future suddenly feel much larger than either of us had planned. Because sometimes the universe sends the right voice to the right place at exactly the moment it is needed. For a long moment after the queen spoke those words, the throne hall remained completely still, as if even the massive crystal pillars were listening to what might happen next. The idea that the universe might have guided a lost survey pilot into the center of an alien court sounded like the kind of poetic explanation humans usually save for books and speeches, not real life. Yet standing there beneath an 80-foot ceiling of glowing crystal, with the violet star lighting the city beyond the windows, it was strangely difficult to dismiss the thought entirely. I looked out across the skyline again. The alien city stretched for miles, towers rising 200 feet into the sky like sculpted waves of blue glass. From this height, the lights moving between them looked like drifting fireflies, quiet and orderly. Whoever built this place understood patience, design, and purpose on a scale that humans rarely reached. I folded my arms loosely and glanced back at Queen Seralith. Back home, I said slowly. We usually call that kind of thing extremely unlikely. The queen tilted her head slightly. Unlikely events often shape history, she replied. I could not argue with that either. My own career as a survey pilot had started with a chance assignment too. A remote exploration program. Now that same line of chance had somehow placed me in front of the ruler of an entire civilization. Around us, the members of the court remained silent but attentive, watching the conversation the way astronomers watch the sky when they suspect something new might appear. Queen Seralith stepped closer to the great crystal window and rested one hand lightly against the smooth surface beside it. Look carefully, she said. I followed her gaze again. From the palace height, the city seemed almost peaceful, but I could now see details I had missed earlier. Wide avenues of glowing pathways wound between the towers. Platforms connected buildings hundreds of feet above the ground. The entire design looked less like a random city and more like a carefully arranged pattern spreading across the landscape. Every structure you see, the queen continued, was shaped by generations who believed stability mattered more than speed. Our people rarely change course quickly. I nodded slowly. Humans are almost the opposite. We change direction, so often we sometimes forget where we started. The faint sound of restrained amusement moved again through the court. Queen Seralith glanced briefly toward the assembled officers before returning her attention to me. That difference may prove valuable, she said thoughtfully. I raised an eyebrow. Because I say things without thinking first. Because you think in ways unfamiliar to us, she corrected. The distinction was subtle but important. I leaned slightly against one of the crystal pillars, still absorbing the reality of the situation. So what happens tomorrow? I asked. Do I just start wandering around the palace telling everyone the truth? The queen considered the question for a moment. Tomorrow, she said calmly, you begin learning. I looked surprised. Learning what exactly? She gestured again toward the city stretching beneath the violet sky. Our world. our people, our history. If you are to speak honestly within this court, you must understand what you are speaking about. That sounded fair enough. I nodded thoughtfully. And after that, Queen Seralith turned from the window and faced the chamber again, her expression calm but purposeful. After that, she said quietly, we discover together whether the honesty of a human can truly change how an ancient court sees its own future. The word learning echoed quietly in my mind as the enormous throne hall slowly relaxed around us. It was a strange feeling, realizing that the conversation, which had started with a crashed shuttle and a possible execution, had somehow turned into the first day of what sounded suspiciously like an education. I glanced again through the massive crystal window where the alien city stretched across the horizon beneath the violet sky. From up here, the buildings looked calm and timeless, glowing towers rising 200 feet above sweeping avenues that curved like rivers of soft blue light. Small aerial craft drifted between them in smooth, silent paths. If someone back on Earth had shown me a picture of this place, I would have assumed it was a piece of digital art. Now it was the view outside my new workplace. I turned back toward Queen Seralith, who was still standing near the window with the composed confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions that shaped the future of millions. So tomorrow I start learning, I said slowly. What does that look like exactly? The Queen folded her hands loosely behind her back and walked a few steps across the crystal floor, the soft echo of her boots carrying through the hall. You will see the city, she replied. You will meet the people who guide our science, our history, and our diplomacy. You will hear how our world became what it is. I nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like a pretty serious orientation program. The faint ripple of restrained amusement moved again through the court. Queen Seralith seemed to be growing accustomed to human commentary. Understanding must come before influence, she said. If your honesty is to mean anything here, it must be informed. That part made sense. Humans had a long history of speaking confidently about things they barely understood, and it rarely ended well. I walked slowly toward the great window beside her and looked down once more at the glowing city. The scale of it all was difficult to process. Towers stretched for miles, their blue surfaces catching the distant starlight like glass oceans frozen in motion. Platforms connected the upper levels of the structures hundreds of feet above the ground, forming a web of elevated walkways that curved between the buildings. The entire design looked less like a city that had grown randomly and more like a carefully planned ecosystem of architecture. You built all this without anyone outside your world knowing, I said quietly. Queen Seralith nodded once. Secrecy gave us time, she replied. Time allowed stability. I leaned slightly against the crystal frame of the window. Humans tend to do the opposite. We show up everywhere first and figure things out later. The Queen considered that for a moment. Perhaps that is why your species reaches so far so quickly, she said thoughtfully. I glanced back at the court behind us. The officers were still watching, but their expressions had changed completely from when I first arrived. Earlier they had looked like guards waiting for a decision. Now they looked more like witnesses observing the start of something unexpected. I straightened and looked at the Queen again. I have to admit something, I said. When my shuttle went down 2 miles from your sacred valley, I thought the worst-case scenario was not getting home. Queen Seralith's golden eyes held a quiet spark of curiosity. And now, I gestured toward the vast city glowing beneath the violet sky. Now it feels like the universe just handed me a front-row seat to something important. The Queen followed my gaze toward the horizon before speaking again, her voice calm but thoughtful. Perhaps it did. Then she turned slightly toward the silent court and added one final observation that made the entire moment feel even larger. Because sometimes understanding begins the moment two very different worlds decide to listen to each other. The throne hall slowly returned to a calmer rhythm after the Queen's final words, but the feeling in the air had changed in a way that everyone present could sense. The earlier tension had disappeared completely, replaced by a quiet awareness that something unusual had begun inside these walls. I stood beside the enormous crystal window and continued looking out over the glowing city, trying to absorb the reality that less than an hour earlier, I had been a stranded pilot beside a damaged shuttle. Now I was standing in the court of a hidden civilization preparing to learn the story of an entire world. The violet star hung low above the horizon, casting long soft reflections across the towers that rose nearly 200 feet into the sky. The structures curved with a kind of elegance that reminded me more of ocean waves than buildings. Craft drifted between them like silent lanterns, their movement so smooth it looked effortless. Queen Seralith stood beside me, watching the same view with the calm familiarity of someone who had seen it every day of her life. "You are thinking," she said quietly. I nodded. "I am thinking about how strange the universe can be." The queen glanced toward me. "Strange in what way?" I gestured lightly toward the skyline. "Back home there are thousands of pilots like me scanning asteroids and mapping planets. Most of them will never see anything like this. Yet somehow I crash land 2 miles from your sacred valley and end up here." Queen Seralith studied the city below for a moment before answering. "Sometimes history begins with an accident." I could not help smiling at that. Humans had built entire legends around that exact idea. Behind us, the members of the court were beginning to disperse slowly, their earlier silence giving way to quiet conversations as officers and advisors exchanged thoughts about what they had just witnessed. The massive hall no longer felt like a place of judgment. It felt like the closing moment of a long day. I turned slightly to face the queen again. "When do we start this learning process you mentioned?" She looked back toward the window where the violet light was beginning to soften along the edges of the distant mountains. "Soon," she replied. "Our day is nearing its end." I followed her gaze toward the horizon. The glow of the star was beginning to dip behind a line of tall crystalline peaks in the distance, and the city lights below were slowly growing brighter in response. The effect was breathtaking, like watching an entire civilization gently shift from day into night. "You have an expression on your world," the queen continued thoughtfully. "A phrase that says when one door closes another opens." I nodded. "Yes, humans say that a lot." She looked directly at me then, her golden eyes reflecting the first lights of the evening city. "Today one door closed for you when your ship fell from the sky." She paused for a moment before adding the thought that made the entire situation feel even more significant. "And another opened the moment you chose honesty instead of fear." I looked out across the glowing towers once more, realizing she was probably right. Somewhere 2 miles away, a damaged shuttle was still sitting in a quiet valley where my day had started. But from the window of the palace, the path ahead looked much larger than anything I had planned. And for the first time since arriving on this world, I found myself genuinely curious about where that path might lead. The violet star finally dipped behind the distant crystalline mountains, and the city below the palace began to glow brighter as evening settled across the alien world. From the great window of the throne hall, the transformation looked almost like a living painting. Blue towers that had reflected daylight now illuminated themselves from within, their surfaces shimmering with soft light that flowed upward through the structures like slow-moving currents beneath the ocean. Craft continued to glide between the buildings, their paths now traced by small glowing trails that curved gracefully through the night sky. I stood beside the window for a long moment, quietly absorbing the view while the vast chamber behind us grew calmer as members of the court gradually departed. Conversations faded, footsteps echoed briefly across the crystal floor, and then silence returned to the 80-foot hall. Queen Seralith remained beside me, watching the same horizon with the composed patience of someone who understood that important moments often ended quietly rather than dramatically. "Your world becomes even more beautiful at night," I said softly. The queen turned slightly toward the glowing skyline. "Our people believe light should never disappear completely," she replied. "Even when the star rests, the city remembers how to shine." I nodded slowly, thinking about that idea. Humans had built cities that blazed with artificial light as well, but there was something different here. The illumination of this place felt intentional, balanced, almost peaceful rather than overwhelming. After a moment, I glanced back across the enormous hall. Earlier, that same room had been filled with soldiers waiting to see what would happen to a human trespasser. Now it was quiet, the polished crystal floor reflecting the soft blue glow of the city outside. It felt less like a throne room and more like the beginning of something new. I leaned lightly against the window frame and let out a slow breath. "You know," I said thoughtfully, "when my shuttle went down earlier today, I assumed I was having the worst day of my career." Queen Seralith looked at me with a faint trace of curiosity. "And now?" I gestured toward the glowing towers stretching across the horizon. "Now I am standing in a palace overlooking a city I never knew existed, talking to a queen who just invited me to learn how an entire civilization works. So I would say the day improved. For the first time since we met, the queen allowed a small but unmistakable smile to appear. It was brief, but it changed the atmosphere of the moment in a way that felt surprisingly human. Perspective, she said quietly, often changes faster than circumstances. I laughed softly at that. Humans had discovered the same truth many times throughout history. We stood there for another quiet moment, watching the lights of the alien city drift into their evening rhythm. Somewhere beyond the mountains, my damaged shuttle still rested in a valley where the day had started. But here in the palace, the future seemed to stretch much farther than that single accident. Finally, Queen Saralith spoke again, her voice calm and reflective. "Lucas Hayes of Earth," she said, "you once told me that humans speak the truth even when they do not yet understand the consequences." I nodded. "That happens more often than we admit." The queen turned toward the glowing city one last time before answering. "Then remember this moment," she said softly, "because today a simple, honest sentence carried you farther than any starship." I followed her gaze across the horizon, watching the lights of a hidden world shimmer beneath the violet night. And for the first time since arriving on this planet, I realized something important. Sometimes the most powerful journey does not begin with a launch. Sometimes it begins with a single sentence spoken at exactly the right time.